So with the new year approaching, Hoyo has graced us with the full information of all the banners in version 5.3. So for this video, we're going to be talking about what we're dealing with in the first half, and I'll upload a second video for the second half. So for the first half, we have the two new Natlan 5 stars being Mavuika and Citlali, alongside a raid up of Bennett, Diona, and Kachina. While the weapon banner, we do have both of their best in slot weapons being the 1000 Blazing Suns, Starcaller's Watch, alongside a raid up of the Stringless, Sacrificial Sword, Fav Codex, Fav Lance, and Lithic Blade. So Mavuika is marking the, I think, 5th release of the next Archon, being the Pyro Archon, so I'm going to briefly explain her kit because I think most of you would probably know this by now. Her skill has two different modes. Tapping it will summon this thing on her back similar to Raiden, which will do off-field pyro damage every 2 seconds. Holding the skill will let Mavuika enter the bike mode, riding a bike, gaining pyro infusion on her claymore, and she will do boosted damage in this mode. Her elemental burst consumes a resource known as Fighting Spirit instead of the regular energy, which initially does one big slice of damage. After this, she will enter her bike mode where her infused attacks will do additional damage based on the Fighting Spirit she consumes. Fighting Spirit can be gained through Night Soul points consumed by your party members, or a very minuscule amount through regular normal attacks. One of her Ascension passives gives her damage percent for the active character after her burst is used. The more Fighting Spirit is consumed to do the burst, the more damage percent the active character gains. This buff decays over time over the course of 20 seconds. So Mavuika is not going to be the Shengling replacer that everyone expected her to be. However, she could be an alternative to Shengling in certain teams that don't necessarily need the strongest pyro application. I would say the closest character that I can compare her pyro application to would be someone like Deya, of course minus the interrupt resist from Deya's passive. Mavuika is clearly made to be a quickswap DPS with some supportive capabilities with her pyro application and one of her damage bonus from her passive. Her elemental burst will be a majority of her damage, so it is ideal for you to trigger both either Vaporize or Melt in order to amplify the most damage out of her. Now the problem with Mavuika really lies in her whole Fighting Spirit mechanic, because in order to at least consistently gain enough to burst every rotation, outside of things like the Spiral Abyss or any challenges, you will need at least another Natlan unit in your team by minimum. Generally, you want Chilonan and Citlali on her team because these two units are going to be in her best hyper carry team, but she can also be used to support characters like Morlani and Kinish. While Kachina might actually help in gaining the Fighting Spirit for her, she doesn't consume it as fast as all the other units, and she is the only 4-star Natlan unit that we have right now. So this is actually quite problematic given that most of the Natlan units that we have are 5 stars who literally just ran for the past few patches, so we have no clue when their rerun is going to be coming around anytime soon. And not to mention that her best team does want the 2 recent 5 stars being Chilonan and Citlali on top of having Bennett on her banner. So overall, I think Mavuika is a very expensive, very costly unit in order to make use of. However, if you do have the Natlan units that I just mentioned, Mavuika could be a unit that you can consider doing because you can actually run her teams. Supposedly, according to a few videos that I've watched, her damage performance is quite comparable to Alucino in her best teams, being barely better in the right situations. And for the second 5-star, we do have Citlali. So Citlali overall is basically a melt support, so I'm going to give you a quick rundown on her kit. Her elemental skill creates a shield that scales off her elemental mastery and summons a thing called its Papa, and she also gains Night Soul points on doing so. Her elemental burst does 1 instance of AoE cryo damage, summons skulls near the enemies with a maximum of 3 enemies, and she also gains Night Soul from casting her burst. Any hits from her skull will also give her a minuscule amount of Night Soul points. Once Citlali has enough Night Soul when its Papa is on the field, its Papa will turn into an angry mode where it will do consistent off-field cryo damage. Her Ascension 1 passive shreds Pyro and Hydro resistance if you trigger either freeze or melt on the enemy when its Papa is on the field. And also doing this gives you occasional Night Souls for Citlali. So in terms of the strength of a shield, it's kind of okay. It's about as strong as a Constellation 6 Diona if she was using a HP weapon, particularly Recurve, and that's if Diona uses the whole skill in order to generate her shield. This is with the assumption that Citlali has about 900 EM running a Sacrificial Fragments, and she has triple EM build with about 100 EM rolls in both the Feather and the Flower. Now, the biggest build for Citlali aside from being a waifu is mostly her Red Shred passive on top of the pretty non-circle impact off-field cryo application. Unlike other cryo characters, like say for example Rosaria, Citlali's cryo application does follow the active character, which is a massive W for her kit. And from what we can see, it seems like her cryo application is pretty decent and can become even stronger with a second cryo unit, thus enabling a forward melt team. And given that she is a catalyst user, she does have the potential to hold the 3-star weapon, also known as the Trilling Tales of Dragon Slayer, to buff any of your attack scaling melt DPS unit. And additionally, because she is actually from Natlan, she can hold the Cinder set in order to buff your teams even further through elemental reactions. So Citlali overall has pretty good role consolidation, and we all know by now with how Genshin is, any characters with pretty good role consolidation tends up to be pretty good unit. And if you don't understand what I mean by role consolidation refers to the ability to hold multiple roles and being good at more than just one thing. An example of characters with good role consolidation would be someone like Bennett or Xingqiu. So in terms of the meta, Citlali would definitely bring more of an impact than Mavuika, and you have to keep in mind that she's also in Mavuika's best team, so yeah. Overall, I think her kit will definitely bring forward melt into the meta, so characters like Arlecchino, Tiaming, and maybe Ganyu or any melt users can definitely benefit a little bit out of Citlali, and I think she's an overall good addition to the current state of the game. Now let's go to the 4-star unit, starting with Bennett. Well, Bennett. You know the rules, and so do I. He's an attack buffer, he also heals, can also be a very good Pyro battery who happens to be the best partner in crime with Xiangling. So let us jump straight to the constellations because you probably already know what he does. So generally, his Constellation 1 is his most important, his C5 is a nice boost, while C6 is relatively situational, while the rest of the constellations are kind of just something that you can ignore. So C1 removes the HP restriction from his burst, allowing it to heal and buff the active character at the same time. On top of that, you also gain additional scaling from Bennett's base attack, making the buff even stronger. A Constellation 5 adds 3 levels to her elemental burst, which is a nice overall upgrade if you want to increase the buff to your team. Now, the infamous Constellation 6 is relatively situational. First of all, we're going to start off with the text. The buff doesn't just apply to melee characters, it also applies to range units, so you will always get a 50% pyro damage bonus regardless of what weapon type you wield. For characters that can benefit from this constellation, it's a mix of a few things like Mono Pyro, certain plunge teams that runs a Pyro DPS unit or Diluc or something like Diluc or Jiaming to a certain extent, maybe Xinyan Plunge, and lastly, a weird team known as Thundering Fury, also known as Razor, that does Burgeon, Hyper Bloom, or Overloaded. For the other constellations, C2 is kind of whatever because your Bennett is going to be above 70% HP for most of the time, because at best all you're doing is just skill into burst or burst into skill, so you very likely you'll iframe half of the time that Bennett's going to be on the field and you're not going to be taking too much damage. And plus, you're also going to be building for relatively high, over 200 ER, so getting more energy recharge is nice, but definitely not a necessary upgrade. Constellation 4 is meh, unless you use it in very specific teams where you want to use the zero ICT application to help you set up your double swirls or certain things that requires pyro application. For the next unit, we have Diona. So Diona is a mix of a shielder and a healer, although the strongest part of her kit is her shield, and her heal is kind of irrelevant to the most part. She does have a pretty decently strong shield, while her cryo application is kind of non-existent with her elemental burst. So let us go take a look at her constellations. So most of her constellations are okay. I think every constellation except for C3 and C4 is quite notable. Constellation 1 gives 15 flat energy once her burst ends, which does help reduce her ER requirements because her burst cost goes from the super high amount of 80 all the way to 65. Constellation 2 makes her shield stronger and also gives you the ability to give shield to your teammates in co-op. C3 adds healing, so that's kind of whatever. C4 decreases her charge shot aim time by a certain amount within a burst, which is mostly for a DPS build, but that's basically a meme at this point. C5 adds 3 levels to her skill, which strengthens her shield even further, and C6 gives you healing bonus if the active character's health is below or equal to 50%. However, if it is above 50%, they gain 200 elemental mastery. This constellation is mostly used for certain melt setups or any sort of teams that requires the elemental mastery buff that can benefit out of it. However, the TLDR for Diona generally is Layla exists, so she's a better option. and with the release of Citlali, you're very likely going to be pulling a better version of her anyways. Now for the third unit, we do have Kachina. So Kachina, you can get one copy of her for free early on in the Natlan Archon quest. To sum up her kit, she summons a... Where did the drill go? She summons a drill, which essentially makes her a construct unit. While it's not actually considered as a part of the construct limit of 3, but it does behave like one. Being an Natlan unit, she's also a Cinder's holder, and her drill can also act as a pretty consistent off-field geo application. She's generally a nice alternate unit for Zhongli in Navia teams, and the same thing can apply to Chiori teams at C0. Her being able to hold the Cinder City set allows her to have a bit more value in teams that don't really necessarily need her geo construct. So now let us jump into her constellations. C1 lets her absorb all crystallized shards nearby whenever she's using or whenever she leaves her drill. It also does give a flat amount of energy on obtaining a crystallized shard. This one is relatively nice for survivability, and it's also pretty helpful to help Navia build up the bullets for her skill. C2 gives Nightsword points on using a burst, and it summons the drill on field if there is none. This generally can be used to extend the drill uptime on top of extending the Cinder's buff. With this constellation, it is also possible for you to trigger the Cinder buff onto different elements. C3 and C5 adds 3 levels to both the skill and burst, which is relatively negligible. C4 gives the active character increased defense whenever there are enemies within the field created from her burst. This is a relatively minor increase in damage. It is nice to have if you do run it with Geo units or Geo DPS that isn't Ningguang or Navia because they're attack scaling, but it's a relatively minor increase. Now Constellation 6, whenever your active character's shield is replaced or destroyed, she does AoE Geo damage which scales off her defense, which can only be triggered every 5 seconds. Now the damage itself is not going to be that big, however the application here really comes from being able to trigger the Cinder City buff once again, which allows you to extend the uptime of the buff and potentially trigger multiple elements for the buff itself. Now for the weapon banner, we're going to start off with Mavuika's weapon, the 1000 Blazing Suns. It has a very high base attack with a very low crit rate. Whenever you use your elemental skill or burst, you gain a buff that gives you crit damage and attack percent for 6 seconds. The duration can be extended whenever the normal or charge attack of the user does elemental damage, extending the duration of the buff all the way to 12 seconds. If the unit is in Nightsword Blessing, the buffs become even stronger and the duration does not decay if the character is off-field. Generally, this weapon is pretty good for quite a few Claymore DPS characters. Characters like Kinish definitely works to a certain extent. Jiaming, if you do include some normal attacks, assuming you're running with say someone like Xingqiu, Navia can definitely benefit of it to some degree. Ito also can kind of work from it to a certain degree. Who else do we have? And I believe Diluc is probably one of the other ones. Chongyun, if you do run a Cryo DPS Chongyun, assuming that you're not running him with a C6 Bennett. Although I think if you do run him with a C6 Bennett, you can still trigger the buff. And of course, Noelle would definitely like this quite a bit. Although I would have to mention that both Noelle and Ito prefers defense over attack, but that doesn't mean that attack is useless. It's just not as useful as having defense buffs. So overall, I think the Claymore is a pretty decent weapon for quite a few Claymore DPS characters. So at the very least, despite being the best in slot for Mavuika, it is still quite usable on other units. Now for Citlali's weapon, the Starcaller's Watch. It has low base attack with a super high EM stat. One of the passive gives even more EM to the character. Whenever the equipping character triggers a shield, the active party member with the shield will deal increased damage to nearby opponents. This ability can be triggered once every 14 seconds. So this is definitely Citlali's best installed weapon, although the problem is that it doesn't provide any sort of energy to help her funnel her burst and reduce her ER requirements, so you'll probably have to consider running something like an ER Sans if you don't have enough energy to burst every rotation. Because if you do want to trigger the off-field cryo application, triggering burst is basically a prerequisite in order to do so. And the EM stat will definitely strengthen the shield. However, there are quite a few units that can definitely take advantage of this catalyst. The passive can be usable on a few units like Baizhu because he does create a shield. Constellation for Yanfei, granted that you do have enough energy to burst every rotation to trigger it. And lastly, Lanyan, which is the new upcoming 4-star Anemo shielder originating from Li Wei. Now, I'm unsure if something like a crystallized shield counts. Very likely it doesn't. So yeah, but the one thing to keep in mind is that the passive is kind of okay. It's not going to be that much better than something like Trilling Tales for Citlali, or maybe like you can consider R5 Wandering Even Star as an alternative, but it's definitely Citlali's best installed weapon, which you should use if you do have it. Now for the 4-star weapons, the Stringless is usable on quite a few characters. Of course, as I'm showing right now, Fischl is one of those units because the EM stat stick is especially useful for her in aggravate teams, on top of the passive buffing elemental skill and elemental burst damage, which is quite appreciated since most of her damage comes from Oz, which is considered an elemental skill. Venti will also enjoy having this weapon, although the passive is kind of useless for his ability because most of his damage is going to be coming from his swirl, so he mostly appreciates the elemental mastery stat and less of the actual weapon passive itself. It is also usable for someone like Natlan, mostly for the passive. However, the elemental mastery is not something that she will benefit much out of unless you run her in teams with very strong Pyro application. And a final honorable mention is Tartaglia if you were to run him in a quick swap burst bow nuke build, because the elemental mastery will amplify the damage done by his vaporize, and the passive is also quite useful for both situations. Now Sacrificial Sword is not exactly the best weapon because the Favonius Sword exists. It's not necessarily best installed on anyone, and even Favonius Sword is better on someone like Xingqiu. I guess the most notable user that can actually use this is Xingqiu if you want to trigger 2 elemental skills to do more damage, or you want to generate more hydro particles to battery your hydro unit. Generally, my recommendation is you get 1 refinement 5, and then any refinements beyond that is something you can just throw away or just call it a day. So both the Favonius Codex and Favonius lands they're both from the Favonius family, so I don't really have to say much. The passive is pretty insane, the ER style is very much appreciated, and you'll never have enough Favonius copies if you intend to build multiple support units that really want the FAF weapons for their best in slot. Particularly FAF lands, I think, is going to be the more valuable between the two, because a lot of Kali's characters don't necessarily need energy, and even if they do, you don't really want to build them on crit because they have other stats that they scale off, which will be more helpful to you. FAF lands, on the other hand, is definitely something that a lot of Polam characters really appreciate. As you can see here, I do have quite a few copies of FAF lands. I think I have one at level 90 on Shangling. So if you do build a few of these characters and you don't intend to pull on 5-star weapons, or at least you don't use 5-star weapons, then FAF lands is going to be very helpful in a lot of your support units. Now the Lithic Blade is kind of an interesting weapon. The passive is essentially a leeway only weapon where every character in the party that hails from leeway will gain a stack which will grant you attack percent and crit rate increase. So this weapon is quite situational. I would say I could see some use on this for someone like a Chongyun DPS build in a national team. Other notable users would probably include someone like Xinyan or Beidou and Xiaoming with enough ER. However, this weapon is less of who can use it and more so to say what team are you running. So it's an extremely team dependent weapon. And keep in mind that this is a Claymore and there are definitely better options out there, so it's generally not really worth pulling for. Just use it if you happen to have no other options. To sum things up, I think these banners are pretty decent for beginners, especially the weapon banner. For the limited banner, if you do want to get more constellations on your Kachina outside of the copy you got from the Natlan quest, that's going to be pretty nice. And what's interesting is that Mavuika's hyper carry team usually involves Melt, and we already have like one of her best support there being Bennett. And if you do want a budget option, like you don't have Shilonen or Citlali, you have a budget Shilonen and budget Citlali right up in the rates up banner. I would say the most notable 4-star character here is definitely going to be Bennett. Mavuika and Citlali are both desirable units, especially it's funny because both of their best teams actually want each other. The weapon banner is kind of nice for beginners. I think I can see the FAF weapons being really helpful. Lithic Blade would be good for any of the Chongyun or Qiaoming users who don't have better options. Stringless is going to be good in the long run because there's quite a few characters I want it, particularly Fischl and maybe Natlan. Sacrificial Sword can be a good starter weapon if you don't have FAF Sword for your Xingqiu. So who are you guys pulling for? Or do you guys intend to skip for the upcoming banner in the second half, or maybe version 5.4 since we have yet to get any sort of drip marketing over on Twitter? Let me know what you're planning to do down in the comments section below, and I think that's it for the banner review. Hopefully you guys find this video useful, and I'll see you guys next time. This is Ethereal, signing off. Peace out.